My name is Mariana. I am 27 years old, and I am a photographer. Living in a 7th-floor apartment in an old building in a big city, surrounded by shadows and memories, has always been a natural choice for me. The walls of my home are adorned with photographs of forgotten moments, details that go unnoticed by the hurried eyes of the city. At night, the orange light filtering through the window transforms my room into a surreal setting, a contrast to the oppressive silence that envelops me. It all began a few weeks ago, on an ordinary night, while I was immersed in editing photos. I looked at the mirror in the corner of the room, and something in my reflection made me freeze. A pale figure, almost ethereal, materialized behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the unease lingered, like a weight on my chest. The next day I received an unusual job to photograph an old house for an art exhibition. Upon entering, I was enveloped by an inexplicable chill. The silence was so profound that it felt almost like a living entity. Each click of the camera echoed like a scream in an abyss. But what unsettled me were the images. The pale woman with empty eyes appeared in every capture, as if she were trying to escape from her prison of wood and stone. As night fell, while I attempted to sleep, the vision returned. Now the figure was clearer, almost tangible. She projected herself in the mirror, her blood-stained hands reaching out to me, while a low, melodious whisper resonated in my ears. I tried to avoid mirrors, covering them with towels and curtains, but her presence could not be ignored. She infiltrated the shadows, the photographs, everywhere I looked. I discovered that the house where I had photographed was the scene of a brutal murder decades ago. The woman in my reflection was not merely a victim. She was a vengeful entity, trapped in a cycle of pain and rage. I decided to return to the house, driven by a dark curiosity. The place was colder than before, almost pulsating with a malignantly inviting energy. Each step I took echoed in a labyrinth of distorted memories. While exploring the rooms, I found a locked door marked with strange symbols that seemed to vibrate at my touch. My intuition told me I should open it. With a push, the door creaked, revealing a room covered in dust and shadows. In the center stood an ancient framed mirror, covered by a black cloth, pulsating as if it had a life of its own. When I uncovered the mirror, a wave of vertigo hit me. It was the same mirror from my apartment, but here it seemed to hold even greater power. The reflection did not show my face, but that of the woman, now clearer, closer. Her empty eyes stared back at me, and the whisper turned into a desperate scream. "Release me." I felt a connection, as if the mirror were calling to me. Without thinking, I touched the cold surface, and suddenly, I was sucked into it, falling into thick darkness. When I finally regained my vision, I found myself in a distorted environment, a twisted version of the house where it all began, now resembling a labyrinth of horrors. The pale woman stood before me, no longer a mere spectator, but a dominating force. She approached and, in a dark tone, revealed that I was not the first to be drawn to her. All her victims were there, trapped, their essence drained to feed her. The photographs I took were a way to capture and consume their lives, a trap disguised as art. I was not there to help her, but to become yet another piece in her collection. Terror seized me. As I looked into the mirror, the woman smiled, revealing a captivating fury. "Now you are part of me," she said, and before I could react, the shadows stirred around me. In my last moment of lucidity, I realized that the power of photography I had always admired had turned against me. To break the cycle, I needed not only to escape, but to destroy the source of her strength. I fought against the panic and ran toward the mirror. With all my might, I pushed my hand against the surface. A scream of pain and rage echoed around me as the images distorted. The connection shattered, and I was hurled back into my apartment, collapsing onto the cold floor. The mirror I once knew was now broken, pieces scattered like fragmented memories. But as I looked ahead, I realized something was wrong. The pale woman was free, and had taken my place in the reflection. A silent scream escaped my lips as she smiled, now dressed in my body, my life. With an empty, soulless gaze, she turned to the camera, ready to capture new victims and make the world an extension of her terror. What I thought was a return to freedom had become an endless nightmare, where the shadows of my life turned eternal, as I helplessly watched, trapped within the reflection, condemned to eternally be the spectator of my own ruin. My name is Carlos, I'm 35 years old, and I'm a lawyer. At first glance, my life is a model of normalcy. A well-kept suburban house, a stable career, and a loving wife who does her best to support me. But the truth is that behind this perfect facade, something dark and unsettling begins to unfold. For the past few months, I have been consumed by recurring nightmares that seem more real with each passing night. The darkness of the early morning is often interrupted only by the absolute silence of my neighborhood, a silence so deep that the sound of movement in the house echoes like a scream. It feels as though something, or someone, is always lurking, watching every step I take. The nightmares are the only part of my life that seems out of control. They always begin the same way. I'm walking down a deserted road, surrounded by a dense, oppressive fog that seems to whisper secrets of death. And then I see him, a man in a black hood, standing in the distance. His gaze haunts me, a weight that makes my heart race. With every step toward him, terror grows in my chest, but I cannot stop. An invisible force pulls me closer. As I get near enough, the man lifts his head. His face is mine, but a distorted, horrendous version. His eyes are hollow, an abyss devoid of life, and blood trickles from his mouth, like a symbol of a tragic fate. He says something to me, a phrase I can never remember upon waking, but the feeling that I am on the brink of a revelation torments me. Every night, I feel the truth drawing closer. Yesterday, however, the premonition came to fruition. I was driving home after yet another exhausting day at the office. The road was deserted, when suddenly, a thick fog began to envelop everything around me. My heart raced. This wasn't normal. As I stepped out of the car, the fog seemed to swallow me whole. And there he was, standing unmoving, the man from my nightmares, with his pale, bloodied face. A chill ran down my spine. This time, his words cut through the air like a sharp blade. "You are already dead." I froze. What did that mean? The fog thickened and an overwhelming panic overtook me. I ran back to the car, but the world around me began to distort. What once felt familiar was now engulfed in a primal fear. The streets were an amalgam of shadows, and I was surrounded by indistinct figures that seemed to watch me with a terrible knowledge. When I finally arrived home, I realized something was wrong. The atmosphere was heavy and dense, as if the very air were saturated with despair. My wife, Laura, looked at me with a mix of concern and sadness, but I couldn't understand why. Something in her gaze told me she knew more than she was willing to reveal. That night, the nightmare intensified. I woke up in an unfamiliar room, lying in a bed that wasn't mine. The clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m., and the silence that surrounded it was terrifying. Every sound, every whisper felt amplified, as if I were trapped in an endless echo. I got up, confused, and when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw my reflection. Instead, I saw the man in the black hood, my own distorted, lifeless image. With each passing day, I realized I was trapped in a hellish cycle of death and rebirth. Every morning I woke up felt like a reset, but everything was wrong. The people around me whispered among themselves, their gazes heavy, as if they were aware that I no longer belonged to this world. Laura seemed distant, as if her presence were a reminder of something that no longer existed. One day, while walking through the house, I found an old photo album, covered in dust. Upon opening it, images of a car accident revealed themselves, and a deep terror seized me. I was there in each one, smiling, but next to a wrecked car, a scene of horror that seemed to have come straight out of a horror movie. It was then that the truth began to reveal itself. I had died months ago. The man from my nightmares was me, a distorted version of my soul, trapped between life and death. The visions I had were echoes of what had happened, desperate attempts of my consciousness to warn me. But I was not ready to accept that. Desperate, I decided to confront the man in the hood. On a thick, fog-filled night, I returned to that road, hoping he would appear. My heart raced, but anger and the need for understanding drove me forward. When he emerged, there was no longer any fear. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I asked, feeling that each word was a scream for freedom. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory, because you cannot escape what you have already done. You need to understand the truth to free yourself. In that moment, I realized that the key to my freedom lay not only in confronting him, but in accepting what I had lost, what I had left behind. It was time to let Laura go, to allow her to move on without the weight of my absence. But the fog began to close in around me, and the sensation of death became palpable. The cycle was about to repeat itself once more. As the man approached, his words echoed in my mind, "You are already dead." And I realized that the true terror was not death, but the inability to let go of the life I once knew. In one last act of courage, I looked into his empty eyes and accepted the truth. Then everything began to crumble. The world disintegrated, the fog dissipated, and for the first time, I felt the lightness of release. The last image I saw was of Laura, smiling, alive, as I faded into the void, finally free from the prison of my own mind. My name is Leticia, and I am 19 years old. I study medicine in an ancient college town filled with dark brick buildings that seem to whisper tales of a grim past. My dormitory, one of those century-old structures, is a place of study but also of isolation. The nights are always cold, and the wind cuts through the cracks in the windows like a distant lament. Often the corridor lights flicker, as if they want to alert me that something is not right. I have always been a skeptic. Ever since I was little, I believed that the world could be explained through logic and reason. But that perspective crumbled when things started happening. One night, while reviewing my notes for an exam, I was suddenly transported to a dark, damp place. It was a narrow corridor, with walls covered in scratches and fresh bloodstains as if someone had fought there. Voices began to echo in my mind, screams of despair, cries of lost souls. The sound of something heavy being dragged reverberated in my ears. It was then that a figure appeared, a woman running toward me, her face contorted in terror. Before I could react, everything disappeared, and I woke up in my dorm, cold sweat covering my body, my heart racing. The visions didn't stop. They became more frequent and intense, a storm of images flooding my subconscious. I could smell the rot in the air, hear heavy footsteps approaching, and on some occasions, cold, invisible hands seemed to touch my skin. The most terrifying vision occurred one night when I clearly saw a young woman trapped in an underground space, a prison made of damp, fetid stone, being hunted by an indescribable creature. The most frightening part? She had my face. The feeling of panic and helplessness began to take over me. What was I supposed to do? Seek help? But who would believe a medical student talking about visions and creatures? I could hardly believe what was happening myself. It was then that, on a sleepless night, I began to research. I found an old news article about a series of unsolved murders in the city that occurred decades ago. The descriptions of the victims were disturbingly similar to my visions. Fear consumed me. Were the victims trying to warn me? Was I the next one? I determined that I needed to save the woman who appeared in my visions. I started following the clues that emerged, but each step led me deeper into darkness, where the echoes of my own sanity seemed to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, the visions grew more vivid, more intense. I was becoming a hostage of an endless nightmare. One night, the visions became unbearable. The woman was closer than ever, and I could feel her pain, her despair. I saw her screaming, and the creature was behind her, a distorted shadow moving like a serpent, the air around it vibrating with the promise of death. What I thought was a warning now felt more like a curse. Desperate, I went to the old basement of the building, a place I never thought I would explore. The air was thick with a sour, moldy smell, and the walls seemed to close in on me. My heart pounded like a drum, and I knew I wasn't alone. As I walked, the echoes of voices intensified. Agonizing screams filled the space, as if I were stepping into a tomb of pain. At the end of the corridor, I saw a half-open door. The urge to enter was irresistible. I pushed the door, and what I found was a room filled with shadows and distorted images. And there she was, the woman, trapped in a cage made of shadows, pleading to be freed. The look of despair in her eyes hit me like a blow, and I realized that the creature was waiting for her. When I tried to reach her, a cold hand grasped my arm, pulling me back. I looked to the side and saw the creature, a grotesque figure with shining eyes and a smile that seemed carved onto its face, as if fear itself had taken form. Its laughter echoed in the room, a cacophony of pain and pleasure. "You can't save her, Leticia," the creature whispered, its voice like an echo of 1,000 laments. "She is you." At that moment, the truth was revealed. It wasn't a battle for the past, but for my future. The visions were not a warning, but a premonition. The woman in my visions was me, and the creature was not a hunter, but a reflection of what I was about to become. Every moment I spent trying to save her only led me closer to my own fate. With a scream of despair, I tried to escape, but the door slammed shut, trapping me in a cycle of terror. The creature approached, its eyes shining with malice, and the last thing I heard was its laughter echoing as darkness enveloped me. I woke up again in my dormitory, but everything was different. The walls felt closer, and the air carried the scent of death and decay. I knew I was trapped in an endless cycle, doomed to relive that nightmare, until I finally accepted that the woman I was trying to save was none other than myself. My name is Eric Rock, and I am an architect. At 42 years old, I thought I had seen it all in life, but nothing could prepare me for the experience I had at the Davila mansion. Hired to restore this relic of the past, I was drawn by the promise of a challenge. The mansion was a fascinating blend of colonial and Gothic architecture, its crumbling walls holding secrets that seemed unwilling to reveal themselves. When I first stepped inside, a strange sensation enveloped me. It was as if the house were alive, watching my every move. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, creating a symphony of whispers. The scent of mildew and desolation permeated every corner, but what troubled me most was the invisible presence that seemed to stir in the shadows. The first few weeks were filled with hard work, and everything seemed to be going well. However, I soon began to have visions. Initially, they were just flashes, shadows dancing at the corner of my eye, figures disappearing at my direct gaze. But on a fateful night, while inspecting the dark basement, the vision became undeniable. There, in the corner, I saw a woman. Her long black hair obscured her face, but the aura of her presence chilled me to the bone. She stood still, yet something about her immobility radiated a deep sadness that echoed in my soul. The next day, I sought out the caretaker. With a grim expression, he told me the rumors surrounding the house. The woman I had seen had been murdered by her husband, and her body was never found. Local legends spoke of her spirit wandering the mansion, seeking justice. What seemed like a simple ghost story began to resonate within me, like a curse slowly unraveling. The visions became more frequent and disturbing. The woman began to appear everywhere, in mirrors, in windows, and even in my work photographs. Each time I saw her, my heart raced. One night, while working late, her image materialized before me, and her voice, soft as the whisper of the wind, echoed, "Help me." Desperate and consumed by the obsession to understand what was happening, I plunged into the history of the mansion. I discovered that it wasn't just the woman I had seen. The house was filled with spirits, the souls of people who had been murdered over the years, that their stories intertwined in a silent lament. Each one sought vengeance, each one crying out for help. The mansion was not merely a building, it was a prison, a tomb for those who had not found peace. As the mystery unfolded, I realized something was changing within me. The visions grew more vivid, almost invasive. I felt the presence of the souls around me, their heavy emotions crushing me. I began to dream of the woman. In each dream, she showed me flashes of her death. The betrayal, the pain, the last breath. Her suffering became mine, and I couldn't escape. With each passing day, the obsession grew. I needed to save this woman, needed to free her. But when I attempted to confront her, something terrible happened. The mansion began to transform. The walls seemed to close in, the hallways twisted, as if they wanted to trap me. The whispers turned to screams, cries of pain and rage. The air grew thick, and the temperature plummeted. I was trapped in a nightmare I never could have imagined. On the night I decided to flee, horror reached its peak. I ran through the dark corridors, but the mansion seemed to shift, to change. Doors slammed shut behind me, and the woman appeared again, her gaze now filled with desperation, and somehow, a wicked smile. "You cannot escape, Eric. You are part of it now." That's when I realized I wasn't trying to save the woman. I was the next one. The mansion was thirsty for a new soul, and in seeking answers, I had become one of them. Despair engulfed me as I struggled to free myself, but the shadows closed in around me. The last glimpse I had was of the woman, now with her face revealed, showing a disturbing and satisfied smile. Then, everything went dark. Now I am a part of the mansion. My scream echoes through the hallways, alongside the whispers of all those who came before me. The Davila mansion has never been alone. It has always been alive, and now I am one of its darkest secrets. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what we see, but what we feel in the silence of the night. My name is Felicity. I'm a 34-year-old investigative journalist, and lately I have been consumed by dreams that torment me. These are not common nightmares, but vivid visions of blood and death. In one of these dreams, I found myself in a dark room, the only light coming from a lamp hanging from the ceiling, swaying slowly. The floor was covered in blood, and what horrified me the most was recognizing the body lying there. A colleague of mine, a journalist who had disappeared weeks ago. The first time I dreamed of this, I woke up in a panic, heart racing, drenched in sweat. The second time, I felt it was a message, and by the third time, I was forced to understand that these dreams were more than premonitions. They were a warning, a window into a horror I couldn't yet comprehend. The city where I live is small, filled with shadowy streets and old houses. At night, the streetlights cast long shadows, like arms reaching out to grab me. I walk these streets, trying to discern the line between reality and the visions that haunt me. Every corner I turn, every noise I hear, seems to beckon me towards a terrible fate. My investigations into my colleague's disappearance led me to an old warehouse where rumors of illicit activities circulated. When I entered, the air was heavy, saturated with the smell of mold and something else, something that reminded me of metal and flesh. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and every step seemed to echo through the emptiness. It was there that I saw the first clue, a yellowed newspaper clipping stuck in a loose floorboard. "Mysterious disappearances continue," the headline read, accompanied by photos of journalists who had never been seen again. My dreams intensified after that. They were now filled with whispers, names of people I didn't know, each resonating in my mind like a siren, begging to be remembered. One night, after a series of dreams that seemed to guide me to a specific place, I made the decision to follow the clues. They led me to a labyrinth of underground tunnels beneath the city. The air there was thin, and each breath became a painful effort. I entered the labyrinth, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from my lantern. The walls were damp and covered with a mixture of mold and something that resembled blood. The floor was a layer of broken bones and fragments of memories from past lives. I could barely see, but each shadow felt alive, each of my steps echoing with the promise of something terrible lurking nearby. As I moved forward, whispers floated through the air, nonsensical words that seemed to resonate supernaturally. Then a cold hand gripped my shoulder, and I spun around, ready to confront whatever it was. But there was no one there. In the heart of the labyrinth, I found an altar made of dark stones, surrounded by melted candles that pulsed like hearts. What lay upon it froze me in place. A body, not that of a journalist, but of a woman, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to transcend death. A hooded figure stood by the altar, murmuring in an ancient tongue, words that reverberated in my mind like a mantra of despair. The figure turned, and I saw that it had no face, only a deep, dark void, an abyss that seemed to absorb me. I didn't know what to do. The sight of the woman staring at me, even in death, felt like a warning. My survival instinct screamed for me to run, but a part of me wanted to understand. Why did this place exist? Why were those bodies there? The flashes of memory grew more intense. Every corridor I explored revealed glimpses of other journalists, anonymous figures disappearing one by one. I was struck by a horrific epiphany. The city was not merely a backdrop, it was a hunting ground. Those responsible for these disappearances were part of society, respectable figures with bloody secrets. When I tried to confront them, I was silenced. A swift blow to the head and everything went dark. I woke up in a familiar place, not the labyrinth, but in a dark room. A space where the echoes of other journalists' screams still resonated in my mind. There was no escape. I couldn't escape. What I had discovered was buried with me. And now, in the silence of the night, the visions of blood and death have become part of me. The city, with its dark streets and long shadows, continued to thrive. On any given night, a new journalist would step into the same streets I once walked, drawn by curiosity and the seduction of the unknown. And the echoes of my story would repeat, as she dreamt of what I had already experienced. The cycle never ends, and thus, Felicity's story becomes a grim warning for all who dare seek the truth in places where the past refuses to rest. The lights of the city continue to shine, but the whispers of the labyrinth remain, waiting for the next victim, willing to listen.